Moscow, June 30, 2011. The door to a rented apartment on Volgogradsky Prospect had been locked for 6 days. The tenant's phone rang without answer. The young woman who lived there had last been seen at her workplace on June 24th, and since that morning, not a single person had heard from her. When police arrived alongside friends and colleagues of the missing woman, the decision was made to force entry. Inside, the rooms offered little sign of disturbance at first glance. Furniture stood in its usual place. Personal belongings seemed undisturbed. It was only when investigators made their way to the bathroom that the reality of what had happened in that apartment became impossible to ignore. The washing machine had been shifted from its position on the floor, pulled forward, and tilted in a way that suggested it had been used deliberately as a weight. Beneath its frame, investigators discovered the remains of a young woman. Her face was concealed beneath a pink sweater, the sleeves of which had been tightly wound around her head and neck. Forensic specialists who arrived at the scene determined that the victim had died as a result of a sustained, combined attack, first strangled using an electrical cord and then fatally wounded with a bladed instrument. That instrument had not been removed from the scene. A kitchen knife remained lodged in the area of the victim's throat, left behind with a deliberateness that would stay with responding officers long after they had cleared the scene. Most chilling of all was the condition of the front door. It had been locked from the outside. Whoever had carried out this act had not fled in panic. They had taken the time to close the door carefully, pocket the keys, and walk away, leaving the apartment in a state of apparent normalcy, and the victim concealed beneath the weight of the machine as though she had simply ceased to exist. The deceased was identified as Margarita Gileva, 30 years old. While forensic teams continued their work in the bathroom, investigators turned their attention to the living room, where the scene presented an entirely different picture. The room looked as though an ordinary evening had simply been paused mid-moment. An open bottle of whiskey sat on the table alongside two glasses. Neither glass had been wiped clean. Fingerprints remained clearly visible on both, suggesting that the guest who had sat across from Margarita that evening felt no particular urgency to conceal the more obvious traces of their presence. An ashtray on the table was filled with cigarette butts from the Parliament brand. When friends and colleagues who had gathered outside the apartment were asked about this detail, their answer was immediate and unanimous: Margarita did not smoke. Not occasionally, not socially, not at all. This single detail confirmed the presence of a visitor who had spent meaningful time in the apartment shortly before the tragedy, someone relaxed enough to smoke freely in the home of a non-smoker, and composed enough to sit and share a drink with the woman who was now lying under a washing machine in the adjacent room. A thorough inventory of the apartment revealed the full scope of what had been taken. A laptop, a camera, and Margarita's mobile phone were gone. 100,000 rubles in cash, a very substantial sum, had also disappeared. But the person who had taken these things had not limited themselves to items with obvious value on any market. Pages had been torn from Margarita's personal address book. From photo albums and framed photographs displayed on the walls, specific images had been carefully removed, not all of them and not randomly, but with clear intention. Someone had moved through the apartment deliberately, selecting and extracting pictures while leaving others untouched. Investigators concluded that the missing photographs almost certainly contained images of the perpetrator. The individual who had sat at that table and shared that whiskey had methodically erased every visible record of their connection to the victim. They had taken the money and the devices. They had removed the photographs. And yet they had walked away, leaving behind an ashtray full of cigarette butts, each one now sealed in an evidence bag and central to the inquiry. To understand who Margarita had been expecting that evening, investigators began rebuilding the full timeline of her final days. 30-year-old Margarita Gileva had come to Moscow from the small Ural village of Marikushi. For the previous 4 years, she had worked as a graphic designer at a printing company, rented her apartment on Volgogradsky Prospect, and supported herself entirely on her own income. On the surface, her life appeared stable and quietly self-sufficient, but a careful review of her digital presence revealed that her personal life had been undergoing considerable change in the months leading up to her death. The last time Margarita had accessed her profile on the social network My World was on June 24th at 7 in the evening, the same day she had last been seen at her workplace, and the same night she would lose her life. Examination of her profile gave investigators their first substantive lead. In March, she had published a personal reflection describing a woman's happiness as being found in the devoted attention of a single man. In early June, she had updated her relationship status to indicate she now had a close companion. Her personal status message read simply, "Everything around is love." These were not the posts of a woman living in isolation. They pointed to the arrival of someone specific in her life, someone she had, for reasons of her own, chosen not to introduce to her friends or mention to her colleagues. In the bedroom, investigators found a red dress. Its placement among her belongings made clear that Margarita had been planning to wear it that very evening. She had been preparing for a guest. Forensic analysis established that her death had occurred during the early hours of June 25th, shortly after her final online activity. The investigation began connecting these pieces. The secret companion referenced in her social media posts, the person who had smoked Parliament cigarettes and shared the whiskey at her table, and the individual who had departed with 100,000 rubles in cash all appeared to be the same person. What investigators uncovered next reshaped the entire direction of the inquiry. Margarita's position at the printing company, it emerged, was simply how she kept herself financially. The true center of her existence revolved around Vladimir Polotov, the lead singer of the Russian pop group Nana. This was not a passing interest or a casual admiration. It had begun approximately 20 years earlier, when Margarita was starting primary school, and over 2 decades it had transformed from the enthusiasm of a child into something that oriented her entire adult life. Her decision to leave a small village in the Urals and relocate to Moscow was, at its core, a deliberate act, a way to reduce the distance between herself and the man she had admired since childhood. By the time of her death, she had succeeded in ways that most devoted fans never do. She had risen to become the chairperson of the group's official fan club. She held Vladimir Polotov's personal phone number. She coordinated events, managed the group's online presence, and served as the primary administrator of fan community resources across the country. Polotov himself would later describe her as a thoughtful and composed young woman who always maintained a respectful professional distance. Her public posts, however, told a somewhat different story, reflecting a devotion that had long since blurred the boundary between public admiration and private longing. One entry expressed a wish to receive, as a New Year's gift, a pair of pajamas printed with the singer's image, so that she might feel close to him even in sleep. The line between the public role she performed as club chairperson and the deeply personal feelings she harbored in private had, at least in the world she constructed online, essentially dissolved. The apartment on Volgogradsky Prospect served a purpose beyond simply providing her a place to live. It had become an unofficial treasury for the fan community she led. Contributions from dedicated fans across Russia had been flowing in for months, gathered in preparation for a significant fan event with the group scheduled for July 3rd. By the time of Margarita's death, the apartment held 100,000 rubles in cash belonging to the collective, sitting in an envelope that police found missing when they arrived. Whoever had been in that apartment that evening had known not only about Margarita's private feelings for the singer, but also about the envelope and exactly where it was kept. The romantic attachment that had drawn this visitor into her home had come paired with very specific, practical knowledge about her domestic arrangements. The physical evidence at the scene consistently suggested a male perpetrator. The cigarette butts, the shared whiskey, the social media posts hinting at a secret companion, the red dress laid out in anticipation, everything initially pointed toward a romantic encounter that had turned into a confrontation. The nature of the attack and the physical effort required to shift the washing machine over the victim's body indicated considerable strength. Investigators developed a working theory that the perpetrator was a clandestine romantic partner whom Margarita had deliberately kept hidden from those around her. A parallel line of inquiry examined tensions within the fan community itself. Fellow fans who were interviewed confirmed that Margarita's position at the center of the group's world had generated real resentment over the years. Her proximity to the singer and her control over club funds and resources had made her the target of hostility from other devoted followers. Investigators found it difficult, however, to reconcile the calculated nature of what had happened in that bathroom with a scenario rooted purely in fan rivalry. The manner of the attack and the cold, methodical staging of the scene that followed suggested someone acting from a place of intense, focused determination, rather than the kind of impulsive conflict that might arise between acquaintances. The search for this unknown male companion became the investigation's primary focus, and for a time, it went absolutely nowhere. No neighbors reported having seen a man entering the building on the evening of June 24th. Biological material recovered from the glasses and cigarette butts produced no matches in any forensic database. The case stalled. Then investigators turned with new attention to the surveillance footage from the building and the surrounding neighborhood. The cameras told a story that none of the investigators had anticipated. Footage from the evening of June 24th and the early hours of June 25th showed a woman entering the building on the evening of the 24th. That same woman did not leave until the following morning. She had remained in the apartment through the entire night and had departed only when the city was beginning its day. What followed, tracked across a network of cameras at metro stations and bus stops throughout the capital, described a route that was anything but aimless. She moved with calm deliberateness, covering considerable distance across the city and stopping at specific points along the way. Near a refuse container in the area of Kuzminki metro station, she discarded a set of keys, later identified as belonging to Margarita's apartment. Continuing across the city by metro to a station on the opposite side, she disposed of a walking umbrella that investigators would trace back to the victim, apparently taken from the hallway when she left the apartment because of rain. Near a bus stop en route to the Matino district, she dropped a mobile phone into a public refuse bin. That phone was subsequently traced back to Margarita. Each item had been left in a different location, a deliberate dispersal designed to scatter the physical evidence of her connection to the victim across the breadth of the capital. Her final destination was a nail salon in Matino, where she had a pre-booked appointment for nail extensions. Having passed the night inside the apartment of the woman whose life she had taken, and having made a methodical circuit of the city to dispose of incriminating items, she sat down in a salon chair to have her nails done. Investigators identified the woman in the footage as Victoria Kharitonova. This was not a stranger to anyone connected to the case. It was a name that had been present throughout the investigation, spoken by almost everyone who had been interviewed. Kharitonova had presented herself as Margarita's closest friend, someone who had been part of her life for 4 years, someone bound to the victim by a common passion and genuine affection. Like Margarita, Victoria was a devoted fan of the group Nana. She served as a moderator of the group's official website and was an active and recognized participant in fan club activities. After the body was discovered, she had not retreated. She had stepped forward. She helped coordinate the search efforts. She maintained regular contact with the police. She provided support to Margarita's parents as they traveled to Moscow in shock and grief. She attended the fan club gathering on July 3rd, the very event for which Margarita had been collecting the 100,000 rubles now missing from the apartment, and was seen mingling with other attendees calmly, engaging in conversation without visible distress. For everyone around her, she had been a source of stability in the aftermath. She had placed herself at the center of the community's grief and stayed there, visible and helpful, entirely above suspicion, until the surveillance footage identified her as the last person to have been in the apartment with Margarita alive. Confronted with the video evidence, Kharitonova could no longer deny having been inside the apartment. She submitted a written confession to investigators. In that document, however, she constructed a version of events carefully designed to reframe the nature of what had occurred and minimize her legal exposure. She acknowledged responsibility for Margarita's death, but rejected entirely any suggestion that financial gain had motivated her. Instead, she claimed the confrontation had been triggered by a religious dispute. She told investigators that she had recently converted to Islam and that on the evening in question, Margarita, after drinking alcohol, had become increasingly hostile and directed offensive remarks toward her faith. According to Kharitonova's account, these remarks had provoked an uncontrollable emotional reaction, and what had followed was not a premeditated act, but a spontaneous, overwhelming response that she had not been able to stop. It was not, she insisted, a robbery that had ended in tragedy. It was the uncontrolled reaction of a person pushed beyond their limits. She later withdrew that confession entirely. Standing before the court, she told judges that the document had been produced under intense pressure from investigators, that a prepared script had been concealed beneath papers on the interrogation table, and that she had been forced to read from it while appearing to speak freely. She claimed to have no genuine personal recollection of the events as described in the confession. Her defense team worked to reinforce this account with additional context. Her sister testified that Victoria suffered from a serious congenital heart condition that prevented her from lifting objects weighing more than 3 kilograms on strict medical advice. References were made to alleged work for state security services, claims that were never corroborated by any supporting evidence. A fiancé named Shamil was presented as the individual whose influence had led to her religious conversion. The defense built a portrait of a physically fragile woman with a serious medical condition who had been overwhelmed by circumstances and coerced into a false confession, someone incapable by virtue of her health alone of committing the physical acts described in the charges. The court had access to the video recording of the interrogation session in which Kharitonova had delivered her confession. What that recording showed did not support her account in any meaningful way. She appeared composed and controlled throughout the session. She sat close to the table, without looking down or glancing at any secondary surface. She described the sequence of events in her own words, with specific and accurate detail about the mechanics and physical progression of what had occurred, with a precision about particular actions and the movement of particular objects that could not have been supplied to her by investigators who had not been present. There was no visible coaching or direction from the officers in the room. The knowledge she demonstrated in that recording belonged to a witness, not a subject being fed information. The investigation ultimately concluded that the motive was neither religious conflict nor spontaneous loss of control. It was romantic rivalry, specific and personal and long-simmering. Vladimir Politov, interviewed about the case, offered a statement that clarified what had been at the heart of the conflict. He confirmed that one of the two women had confided in the other that she had feelings and intentions toward him, and that the second woman had harbored exactly the same feelings. Two women who had believed themselves to be genuine friends had each been quietly nursing the same private hope, neither aware that the other shared it, until the evening of June 24th. That evening, Margarita had made a decision that would ultimately cost her everything. She had taken the red dress from her wardrobe and shown it to Victoria. She had told her closest confidant that at the fan event on July 3rd, she did not intend simply to attend as the club's organizer. She intended to stand in front of Vladimir Politov and tell him how she felt, openly and directly. For Victoria Kharitonova, who had spent years as the quieter presence in the background of the fan world that Margarita had built and led, who admired the same man and had never found a way to bridge the distance between herself and her own feelings, this announcement was devastating. Margarita represented everything that Victoria was not in that shared world. She led the organization. She had the singer's personal contact details. She had direct, regular access to him. She was more visible, more connected, and more capable of acting on what she felt. The possibility that Politov might respond to her was real in a way it simply was not for Victoria, and Kharitonova made a decision from which there was no return. She would remove her rival before Margarita ever had the opportunity to put on that dress. The financial element provided a secondary layer of motivation. Kharitonova was fully aware of the envelope in the apartment. She had been part of the community that had contributed to it and understood exactly what it represented. Investigators concluded that the decision to take the money, alongside everything else, spoke not to impulse, but to premeditation, the actions of someone who had decided, before arriving at that apartment, that this evening would serve more than one purpose. The woman Margarita had trusted with her most personal dream had turned that trust into a liability. Investigators reconstructed the sequence of the evening in considerable detail. Kharitonova had arrived at the apartment carrying a bag of groceries, yogurt, strawberries, and apples. The women shared coffee together in what appeared, to any outside observer, to be a perfectly ordinary visit between close friends. Margarita poured herself a glass of whiskey. Victoria declined and drank water, citing her new religious commitments. Then the subject of the red dress entered the conversation and the atmosphere changed. Words became heated. The two women struggled, and during the confrontation a television set fell from a shelf, pulling its electrical cord loose from the rear panel as it came down. Kharitonova grabbed the cord. While Margarita was momentarily disoriented, Kharitonova looped it around her neck. When Margarita lost consciousness, Kharitonova took a kitchen knife from the kitchen, initially to cut the cord free from the television, and then dragged the victim into the bathroom. She reportedly attempted to bring her around by splashing water on her face. When it became clear that Margarita could not be revived, she reached for the pink sweater resting on the washing machine and wound its sleeves around the victim's head and face, covering her eyes. She then used the knife to inflict additional wounds to the neck and upper body to ensure that there would be no possibility of survival. She positioned the washing machine over the body, returned to the other room, turned off the lights, and lay down on Margarita's bed. She did not flee the scene. She remained through the night, in the apartment with the body of the woman she had killed, and waited until the Moscow metro began its morning service before gathering the valuables, collecting the cash, and beginning her carefully planned route across the city. The trial proceeded with the full weight of the forensic evidence, the surveillance footage tracking her movements across the capital, and the recording of her initial detailed confession. The court took into account both her submission of that confession and her subsequent retraction of it. It also considered her personal circumstances, including the care responsibilities she held toward her elderly parents. Victoria Kharitonova was found guilty and sentenced to 9 years and 6 months in a general regime correctional facility. She was additionally ordered to pay 3 million rubles in compensation for moral harm to Margarita's family and to cover all costs associated with the funeral and burial. The lives of those who remained carried their own particular weight. Vladimir Politov continued his career in music. The tragedy that had unfolded around his name without his knowledge or involvement receded from public attention, though it left a mark on those who had followed it. Years later, it became known that he had married a fan, confirming in the most painful way possible that the scenario both women had imagined had not been a fantasy. The story they had each privately written for themselves had been possible. It had simply, in the end, belonged to someone else. Politov did not remain entirely apart from the grief the case had left behind. He made the journey to the small Ural village where Margarita had grown up, and in a gesture that few expected, visited her grave and stood there in silence. The attention she had written about in her social media posts, the singular and devoted attention of one man that she had described as the definition of happiness, arrived for her only in this form, a quiet, somber visit to a headstone in the village she had left behind as a young woman with a very specific and very consuming dream. Victoria Kharitonova did not complete her full sentence in custody. She was released on parole before the term concluded. Returning to civilian life, she eventually built the kind of existence that Margarita had described in those final social media posts, a life defined by companionship, love, and family. She married, though not the man at the center of this case, and in time she found the settled domestic life that had formed the center of so many of her desires. Margarita Gileva's story ended at the age of 30, in a rented apartment on Volgogradsky Prospect, beneath the weight of a washing machine, on the night she had put on coffee for her closest friend. The woman who took her life is free. The red dress was never worn.